The skull is a bony structure that forms the head in vertebrates. It supports the structures of the face and provides a protective cavity for the brain. Figure 1. Two sets of bones form a skull. Cranium. Facial bones. Cranium. The cranium encloses and protects the fragile brain tissue and is composed of 8 large flat bones. There are 8 components of cranium. Frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, occipital, sphenoid, ethmoid. Frontal bone. The frontal bone forms the forehead, the bony projections under the eyebrows, and the superior part of each eye's orbits. Parietal bones. The paired parietal bones form most of the superior and lateral walls of the cranium. They meet in the midline of the skull at the sagittal suture and form the coronal suture, where they meet the frontal bone. Temporal bones. The temporal bones lie inferior to the parietal bones. They join them at the squamous sutures. Occipital bone. The occipital bone joins the parietal bones anteriorly at the lambdoid suture. In the base of the occipital bone is a large opening, the foramen magnum, which surrounds the lower part of the brain, allows the spinal cord to connect with the brain. Sphenoid bone. The butterfly-shaped sphenoid bone spans the width of the skull and forms part of the floor of the cranial cavity. In the midline of the sphenoid is a small depression, the sella turcica or Turk's saddle, which forms a snug enclosure for the pituitary gland. Ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is very irregularly shaped and lies anterior to the sphenoid. It forms the roof of the nasal cavity and part of the medial walls of the orbits. Facial bones. 14 bones compose the face. 12 are paired, only the mandible and vomer are single. Maxillae. Palatine bones. Zygomatic bones. Lacrimal bones. Nasal bones. Vomer bone. Inferior nasal conchae. Mandible. The eye and ear. The eye. Figure 2. We can explain eye anatomy in 2 parts. External and accessory structures of eyeball. Internal structures. The eyeball. External and accessory structures of eyeball. The accessory structures of the eye include the extrinsic eye muscles, eyelids, conjunctiva, and lacrimal apparatus. Eyelids. Eyelashes. Conjunctiva. Lacrimal apparatus. Lacrimal glands. Lacrimal canaliculi. Lysosome. Extrinsic eye muscle. Internal structures. The eyeball. Now that we have covered the general anatomy of the eyeball, we are ready to get specific. Fibrous layer. The outermost layer consists of the protective sclera and the transparent cornea. Sclera. Glistening, white connective tissue, is seen anteriorly as the white of the eye. Cornea. Central anterior portion of the fibrous layer, crystal clear. Light enters the eye through this part. Vascular layer. The middle eyeball of the layer. It has 3 distinguishable regions. Choroid. Most posterior, blood-rich nutritive tunic that contains a dark pigment which prevents light from scattering inside the eye. Ciliary body. two smooth muscle structures. Iris, a thin annular structure, responsible for controlling the diameter and size of the pupil, and thus the amount of light reaching the retina, defines eye color. Figure 3. Pupil. Rounded opening of pigmented iris, through which light passes. Retina. A thin layer of tissue that lines the back of the eye on the inside, located near the optic nerve. The purpose is to receive light that the lens has focused, convert the light into neural signals, and send these signals on to the brain for visual recognition. Lens. A transparent, biconvex structure, along with the cornea, helps to refract light to be focused on the retina. The ear. Anatomically, the ear is divided into three major areas: external, outer ear; middle ear, or tympanic cavity; internal, inner ear. Figure 4. External, outer ear. The external ear is composed of three parts. Pinna, the shell-shaped structure surrounding the auditory canal opening. External acoustic meatus, a short, narrow chamber carved into the temporal bone of the skull. Tympanic membrane. Sound waves entering the auditory canal eventually hit the tympanic membrane, or eardrum, and cause it to vibrate, the canal ends of the eardrum, which separates the external from the middle ear. Middle ear, tympanic cavity. The middle ear, or tympanic cavity, is a small, air-filled, mucosa-lined cavity within the temporal bone. It has three parts. Openings. The tympanic cavity is flanked laterally by the eardrum and medially by a bony wall with two openings, the oval window and the round window. Pharyngotympanic tube. Runs obliquely downward to link the middle ear cavity with the throat and the mucosa lining. Ossicles. Consists of three small bones. Malleus. Incus. States. Internal, inner ear. The internal ear is a maze of bony chambers, located deep within the temporal bone behind the eye socket. It has three parts. Cochlea. Vestibule. Semicircular canals. The vertebral column and thoracic cage. The vertebral column, spine. The vertebral column extends from the skull, which it supports, to the pelvis, where it transmits the weight of the body to the lower limbs. Hence, it serves as the axial support of the body. Figure 5. The spine is formed from 26 irregular bones connected and reinforced by ligaments that result in flexibility and curvy structure. Components of spine. Spinal cord. Surrounded and protected by the vertebral column and runs through its central cavity. Vertebrae. Spine consists of 33 separate bones called vertebrae. There are 5 types of vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae. The 7 cervical vertebrae form a neck region of the spine. Thoracic vertebrae. The 12 thoracic vertebrae are all typical. Lumbar vertebrae. The 5 lumbar vertebrae have massive block-like bodies. Sacrum. The fusion of 5 vertebrae forms the sacrum. Coccyx. The coccyx is formed from the fusion of 3 to 5 tiny, irregularly shaped vertebrae. Intervertebral discs. The individual vertebrae are separated by pads of flexible fibrocartilage intervertebral discs that cushion the vertebrae and absorb shock, while allowing the spine flexibility. Figure 6. Centrum. Disc-like, weight-bearing part of the vertebra facing anteriorly in the vertebral column. Vertebral arch. Arch formed from the joining of all posterior extensions, the laminae and pedicles, from the vertebral body. Vertebral foramen. Canal through which the spinal cord passes. Transverse processes. Two lateral projections from the vertebral arch. Spinous process. Single projection arising from the posterior aspect of the vertebral arch. Superior and inferior articular processes. Paired projections lateral to the vertebral foramen, allowing a vertebra to form joints with adjacent vertebrae. Thoracic cage. The thoracic cage is routinely called the bony thorax. It has three parts: sternum, ribs, thoracic vertebrae. Figure 7. Sternum. The sternum, breastbone, is a typical flat bone and the result of the fusion of three bones: the manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. Landmarks. The sternum has three important bony landmarks: the jugular notch, the sternal angle, and the xiphisternal joint. Jugular notch. The jugular notch, concave upper border of the manubrium, can be palpated easily. Generally, it is at the level of the third thoracic vertebra. Sternal angle. The sternal angle results where the manubrium and the body meet at a slight angle to each other, so that a transverse ridge is formed at the level of the second ribs. Xiphisternal joint. The xiphisternal joint, the point where the sternal body and xiphoid process fuse, lies at the level of the ninth thoracic vertebra. Ribs. 12 pairs of ribs form the walls of the bony thorax. True ribs. The true ribs, the first 7 pairs, attach directly to the sternum by costal cartilages. False ribs. False ribs, the next 5 pairs, either attach indirectly to the sternum, or are not attached to the sternum at all. Floating ribs. The last 2 pairs of false ribs lack the sternal attachments, so they are called the floating ribs.